It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this session on, quote, programmatic specificity we can believe in. Or perhaps, as the Prime Minister who coined those immortal words might have put it, can I say, in relation to the question of DPS compliance, let me be quite clear that when it comes to working families, the government is committed to developing some form of conceptual synthesis in order to deliver a fair shake of the sauce bottle to the mums and dads of Australia, mate. If only that were an exaggeration. But in short, must Australia be resigned to a fate of awful officialese and brain-dumbing cliché from our politicians? After all, the Americans have just traded a leader who asked, "Is our children learning?" and then demanded that we not misunderestimate him, for a leader who has rediscovered rhetorical sentence structures and insisted, yes, we can. But can we? And even if we do, is soaring rhetoric any better for democracy than bureaucraties? Or are they both ultimately about shaping public perceptions purely for the benefit of politicians? Are we likely only to conclude, as our aspiring Prime Minister Tony Abbott once did in Parliament, it's very clear, I think, from the totality of the opposition's question and the totality of the Prime Minister's answer, exactly what the context of the answer was? Well, to tackle the context of the answer today are former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees, political journalist extraordinaire Annabel Crabb, and that one-man transatlantic institution, Christopher Hitchens. Each of our panellists will speak for 10 minutes or a shade under 10 minutes, after which we'll have some general discussion and open up the floor to your questions. Final housekeeping, of course. Everyone, please turn off your mobile phones before we begin. Anyone caught letting their mobile ring will be immediately subjected to an unending loop of the collected clichés of Peter Costello. But let's begin with a man who is anything but a cliché. Former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees, whose genuine interest in clear language is perhaps no better demonstrated by the fact that he's no longer Premier. Now, I first met Nathan at the Premier's Literary Awards last year, the kind of function where Premiers swan in, present some cheques and swan out. But to the horror of his minders, Nathan not only didn't swan out, but he walked around the room and started to talk to people at every table. Even more worrisome for the apparatchiks was that the conversation was both engaging and unambiguous. Before they could whisk him off for a quick injection of jargon and cliché, he bumped into the Plain English Foundation table and said, "Plain English, do I need to talk to you?" But he did more than just talk. In no time at all, he'd announced he was issuing a memo to all New South Wales public servants mandating plain English as the standard for all communications with the public. Of course, this radical and revolutionary idea was so radical and revolutionary that within weeks he was no longer Premier. But surely that is just a coincidence. Please join me in welcoming our former Premier, Nathan Rees.
I assume that mic's working. Okay. Firstly, thank you, Neil, for that opening, and also thank you for the work. It's good to be here. Look, a couple of observations I would make at the outset, and the first is I think it's important to make distinctions between the tiers of government you're talking about when we're talking about language and communication more broadly. For state government in a jurisdiction like Australia, you're not sending people to war, unless you're talking about a war on drugs perhaps, but you're not making the sorts of decisions that an Obama or a head of state at a national level has to make. The truth is that state government and the activities therein are actually pretty mundane. You've got to make sure that the lights go on when you flip the switch. You've got to make sure that water comes out of the tap and the trains run on time and all those sorts of things that many of you are familiar with. Incidentally, for those of you who are from interstate or internationally, welcome to Sydney and welcome to Australia. But that's the reality, that the vast bulk of activity at a state government jurisdiction happens beneath the radar, and despite the demands of our friends in the fourth estate each day, you're not actually doing earth-shattering things every day. You're making sure, wherever you can, to the best of your ability, that the basic services are being delivered. If, for example, we've talked about the soaring rhetoric of the Obamas and so on, I hazard a guess that if an Australian politician sought to deliver one of those Obama-like speeches in Australia, they'd be booed off the stage. And I think there's a number of cultural and historical reasons for that, but we might touch on those later on. But Neil's point around plain language in government and plain language in communication, plain language in government departments, I think is an important one. And it's important for a number of reasons. My staff used to tear their hair out in despair when I'd be sending speeches or media releases back and saying, look, we don't use words like innovative, we don't use words like strategy, we don't use, if someone bowls up capacity building to me again, I'm going to vomit. And I'd keep sending these things back, and eventually saw Neil and prompted that memo, which I'm certain has fixed everything. But it's not just governments that do this, it's the corporates do it. Anyone in this room who's picked up an annual report or a glossy brochure from a corporate will see that the language used is just appalling. If we read these things, and you have to read them again and again to try to distill any of the content or meaning at all. And the important part of this, for mine, is that the more obscure the language is that we use as politicians, as opinion leaders, as international figures, and as media reporters, the more obscure that language is, the more people you're locking out of appropriate policy debates. Now, I think that matters. I think it matters for the health of democracy. I think it matters for, dare I say it, social inclusion. And I think it matters for the quality of public policy debate and the democracy in general. So that's what motivates me towards a plain English approach to things. Many of you in this room will have read Orwell's essays on these matters, and he himself at the time writes that we all succumb to these phrases on occasion. That's not the point. The point is to be aware when we're using language that isn't accurate, that doesn't portray things in as simple and as clear a fashion as we might be able to. So that's what motivates me with regards plain language. I guess where it becomes difficult is when you're standing up in front of a media throng each day generally, and you're having questions fired at you from a metre away, and there's cameras thrust in your face and so on. And we saw Tony Abbott this week, and I felt some sympathy with Abbott on the 7:30 report. But true. But the reality is that in politics, and you might disagree with this, but I've got rock-solid examples to point to, the treatment of political leaders goes like that by the media. Sometimes, I used to sit next to Kevin in press conferences in the early days of his Prime Ministership in Canberra, and I'd be sitting there and there'd be very respectful media pack. And I'd be sitting there thinking, there is no way in the world I would get away with that in Sydney. And subsequent to that, Kevin now cops a hard time from the media pack down there as well. But what it means is that for our political leaders, there is no room for equivocation in your remarks. There is simply no room for error. There's certainly no room for whimsy. If you do, you run the very real risk of being smashed mercilessly for it. Now, to the eternal frustration of my staff, they would try to get me to stick to the script, and too often I departed from it. They'd have to mop up for the next couple of days. But, and I'm sorry if any of you are in the room, but that's where it gets difficult. Ultimately, there's a great deal of research being done on this sort of thing, how many thousands of messages people get bombarded with each day, that if you're trying to penetrate with a critical government message, it's very difficult.